Welcome back to this part 5 of how to build an audio PC. When we last left our hero, he was about to place an entire system within the case. So let's rejoin the action now and follow through on the building of this audio PC. Wallop! Here's the case. What a lovely thing. What an enormous thing. Now this is the Fractal Design Define R6. I've used many different versions of this case. This is the current latest one. It's very good, it's very thermally insulated, it feels nice, it's got a good metal structure to it, lots of room, lots of great fans. It's a good case. But again, you don't have to have this case, whatever case you're using. Hopefully the principles and the things I'm going to show you now will be applicable to whatever case that you've got. First thing to do, take off both sides, because you're going to scratch it. If you put this down on a workbench or anywhere else, you will scratch it and that will make you sad, and we don't want to be sad. So take both sides off. Now there also might be a special way of doing it, which you might need to consult the manual, but usually they kind of pull off, and then put this somewhere sensible where you're not going to scratch it. Right, that's both sides off. Good Lord, there's a lot of stuff. Now this is the underside, and you might find some clever bits and pieces in here. I mean, I've got drive trays here. I've got, there's a little box of bits that slides out of this bit here, which is all the accessories you're going to need for screwing everything in. They are very important. There's some kind of what looks like a fan controller there that I'm not really interested in. Now this is the underside, so the motherboard's going on the other side of this, but here I actually have a couple of places for SSD drives, which is very useful. Gets those out of the way. Otherwise in here I've got a bunch of cables which route front ports through to the motherboard. Say drive bays there. Let's show you where the fans are. I have a couple of fans in the front here, which will be pulling cold air in. And I have a fan on the back here, which is pushing air out. So that's my airflow from front through the motherboard, through the cooler, and out the back. Here then are the PCI slots, and the power supply goes at the bottom. So this is the main cavity into which the motherboard's going to go. Now I would recommend installing everything else before you put the motherboard in. The reason being is the motherboard is the center of fragility. If you drop a screwdriver, drop a hard drive, and it lands on the motherboard, that could be devastating. So don't do that. Let's put in the power supply, let's put in the other drives and those bits and pieces first before we stick in the motherboard. So let's start with the power supply. The power supply is heavy and cumbersome and awkward, and as I say, if you drop it, it's going to break things. So let's put that in out of the way first. You might want to consult the manual, because this will show you exactly where things are supposed to go and what the screws are, because you get a big box of screws, you're not quite sure what any of them do. So installing the power supply is in this manual very well displayed. You may find there's no manual at all in your case, or something which is just in Chinese, but you know, who knows. In this one it's pretty good. We've got a little bracket, it's all down here, I'll show you in a second, that goes around the power supply, which makes this just that little bit more slightly complicated. But there we go. Now some people say you should install everything upright in a tower, other people lay it down. I tend to lay things down, but I think in this build I'm going to be setting it up, laying it down, setting it up, laying it down, number of times, depending on what we need access to and what the video cameras can see. So this here is the power supply cavity. It sits behind this, and it has these two, what they call them thumb screws, but they don't always come off that easy. So this is going to go over the front of the power supply, which is going to slip in here. How easily? I'm not sure yet. But by the looks of things, I'm probably going to have to stand this up the other way in order to do this. So here's my power supply. It's an EVGA 650G Plus Supernova. Supernova. Has annoying plastic on the logo here, which I feel I have to remove. Now this is a completely modular power supply, which means it doesn't have an enormous trail of cables coming off it. You may well have bought one which does. That's all right, you just have to contend with it. But I really like the modular ones simply because they don't have the huge trail of cables coming off, so that you can install it easier and then plug in the cables that you need. So which way up should it go? Which way round should it go? Well, often the bracket that you took off gives you a bit of a clue. But honestly, it can go either way up. But you'll probably find that these screw holes here only fit one way round on your power supply. However, on this one, it can go either way. Now, the way a power supply keeps cool is with this enormous fan here, and this is pulling air into itself. Now, again, you can think about the airflow in your system as to which way up you're going to mount it. Because if you have it mounted so that the fan is within the case, so the fan is facing into the case, then that's going to be pulling air, presumably hot air, out of the center of your system through the power supply and then out the back. You don't really want that. I mean, that's often how power supplies have traditionally been mounted inside cases. But more recently, cases have grills on the bottom, as this one does. In fact, it even has a filter on the bottom. So it's better to have it mounted this way, so you're pulling air up through the bottom of the case, cold air from outside, not warm air from inside. You're putting that in, and then the power supply has its own little airflow circuit. So it's pulling air in from the bottom of the case and sending it out the back. So it doesn't contribute to the heat of the case as a whole, and it's not taking hot air from the case to try to cool itself. So that is the way we're going to orient this power supply in this case. Now, this new version of this case has this really annoying solid bit here, which means I can't grab hold of the power supply that I'm putting in this hole. So, okay, I can get to it from underneath. So that is going to slide in there and be mounted with the bit that I haven't put on it yet. Now, you should get screws for mounting in the box that came with the power supply. Just 4 little screws. Standard, good old-fashioned computer screws these are. They're the same screws that hold in mechanical hard drives and also hold in PCI cards. If your case doesn't have a bracket like this, then you'll be doing this physically on the side of the case. And then this is going to go this way round so that the fan is going towards the bottom of the case here, like so. So there you go. I currently don't have any idea how I get the cables from the power supply to the motherboard, but I'm sure that sort of thing will reveal itself. Right, next up, I'm going to install an SSD drive here. There's my Samsung 860 Evo SSD drive. You can use either port, it doesn't really matter. Unscrew the little pin, and then it should just fall out. And then these are going to mount onto here, how they match up with screws that go through from underneath. Now you can have it in either orientation, because there's cables obviously you're going to need to attach on here. So you could have the cables coming up this way or from the bottom, depending on how you want to run your cabling. I imagine what will look better is for them to come this way. So that's what I'm going to go for. So you should find screws in your accessory box. Now for SSD drives, if your screws aren't labelled, you tend to be after the smaller ones. They seem to be a little bit domed and smaller. So those are the ones which are going to screw this together. So once that's screwed in, I can then mount it back onto our little hidden bit here. We'll cable it up in a minute. I want to install my other hard drive, which is this whacking great big Western Digital 4TB fella here. Now these go into these trays. There is room here for an optical drive. If you have one of those and want to use one of those, you can plug that in at the top. But otherwise, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bays for great stonking mechanical drives. Now I know that I'm going to be carrying over a whole load of drives that stick in here from my current existing system. And so this is my first extra one. I think I'm going to put this towards the bottom. So how we do that is by taking out the tray, unscrewing it first. Ugh. And then the hard drive is going to mount inside this with some grommets and screws from underneath. Again, check your own manual for your own case as to how they go in. These sorts of rubber grommets are really useful in reducing vibrations because hard drives vibrate like crazy things because they have mechanical things spinning inside them. And so these sorts of grommets are incredibly useful. And in these ones, they go in through the hole and then you push them into the smaller section. Yeah? Now you're going to want the back of your drive where the cables are going sticking out of the back where you can access them. It's no good buttoning them up to the front. They need to go the right way round so that the cables here are going to be coming out this way. So I place it correctly, line it up nicely, and then you get the drive mounting screws. These little things here, or rather these larger things that go into. These sorts of trays can also accommodate the smaller drives, the SSD drives. It usually has room for that. So you can use laptop drives or SSD drives or whatever it is onto these individual trays. What I like about this here is that it just puts your SSDs kind of out of the way. So it's not using up a drive tray which you could use for a larger hard drive. Of course, there's limitations because of what your motherboard can support. And on this particular system, it can support up to 6 drives. And we have 6 slots here. So I don't really need to be putting an SSD here. It's just handy and out of the way. So this then slots back into here. Right, with those two physically installed, we now need to think about the cabling. So if, like me, you went for a modular power supply, you're going to need to find the right sort of drive cable. And the SATA drive cable power cables are these ones here. They're kind of flat. You usually get them in sort of a brace of 3, I suppose. Now, can I reach this from here to here? No, I cannot. So I'm going to be using 2 lots of these. One is going to go in here. Now, how you do it is just, in my view, you're looking to do things as tidily as possible. So I'm going to plug this in like this, so these other cables kind of fold themselves naturally out of the way. And plug it in. This is also going to follow a similar sort of trajectory and is going to find itself plugged into the power supply here. Now you might not be able to see now exactly where to plug things in if you're using a modular power supply as I am, so maybe these should have been plugged in first. But who knows? Who knows? I'm sure it's all completely possible. So you're going to have to get into that cavity with some kind of light so you can see exactly what's going on. Now all the ports on the power supply are labelled, so I can see the ones for SATA power. Then I need to plug a second one in for this other hard drive. Super. So I've now got all these cables hanging off here. I'm going to take one of them and just leave it neatly there for future hard drives. The other one I'm going to bring over here. Now if you've got a stack of hard drives, you can arrange these cables here in such a way that they kind of manage to go into that one, into that one, and into that one, all just sort of folding nicely. So this one here, it doesn't really matter which one I take, so I'm going to take this one, clear those other ones out of the way, and rock that into there. You have to be mindful of where the case lid is going to be, where the back of the case is going to be. You don't want anything sticking out. So that's power. That's power to this drive and this drive. Now it needs data. Now the data cables come in the motherboard box. So you need to find where on earth it was you put that. So you tend to get 2 sorts of cables. You get one with a flat end, like this, and you also get one with a right angle end, like that. Your motherboard will usually supply at least one of each. Now, the consideration you need to make is, where is that data cable going to go? How are you going to run your cables? Because, I mean, there's art forms to running cables within these cases. I mean, the general idea is that the tidier the system is, the better the airflow, therefore the better the cooling, the lower the noise. So if you can make things quite tidy, it's good for your mind, it's good for your soul, but it's also good for your system as a whole. So for this drive here, I'm going to see how best to route it. It's going to route underneath itself into the power supply cavity, and then there's a hole here to get it into where the motherboard is. So that's going to be its route, and that then just clips there. For this drive, this is going to go straight out the bottom along here and up through the same hole. If you're being really clever, you'd label the cables so you know which is which, but we can work that out. We can work that out, and essentially we've come to the point where we're going to need to put the motherboard in and connect everything together. It's quite exciting. It's quite exciting. These sorts of cables and stuff are all going to connect to the motherboard in a minute. We won't worry about them just now, but they will be poking through a hole of some sort at some point. Before we install the motherboard in here, we need to make sure that the risers are in place that the motherboard is going to mount on, and that the I/O shield is in the hole down here. Now you might remember that I told you to take this out of the box earlier. Yes, it's this thing. Now this is a little pig of a thing. It's sharp, it's flexible, it is going to slice your fingers open just by looking at you. Now this goes on, is what the motherboard matches up to. It meets it, and this presents all of the ports properly out the back of the computer. It has to fit correctly. They often have little twangy bits, which can sometimes, when you try to put the two together, actually go inside the USB port that it's trying to provide for you, rather than sit on top. So just check, and if it has any of those bits, like this one does, just bend it up a little bit, so that it has no chance of that happening. And then you place it within the hole here from the inside, pushing that way, and with a bit of luck, if your case is well made, it will just slot in there nicely. But usually, because these things aren't always exactly precise, you're going to have to push and push and break, then your thumb goes through one of the holes, it takes your nail off, you then start squirting blood everywhere, and it's just a real mess. The orientation of this is that it goes where the small holes where the audio bits are, that goes towards the PCI slots. So it goes in that hole. You might need to move the fan connector away from the rear fan, which is going to get in the way and going to start getting you frustrated to the point you're going to shout at things. But if you can get that bugger out of the... you wire, good! Right, good. This way round. Put it up against the side. And then just push on the edges to see whether you can get that to snap in. These are pigs every single time. Then you start looking at it and you're thinking, well, there must be a way that this fits. Surely it fits. It must fit. I mean, it's designed for each other, isn't it? There we go. That's in. No, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. So maybe a good thing to do is just to lean on them a little bit to see whether you can push back the edges to give them a better chance. Going in this bleeding hole. There! Ta-da! So with enough brute force and risk-taking, you can get that to work. You can get it to work. Right, with that in, back to checking these risers. Now in this case, I can see that I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 risers already placed. Now your case may not have that, in which case you'll find the risers themselves as these little screws within the bag of accessories that came with your case. And these need to be placed into the correct holes. Where are the correct holes? Well, hopefully they'll be labelled. If not, you're going to need to get your motherboard and line it up so that you can see which holes it needs to be mounted on. Because motherboards are not screwed to the flat bottom of the case. They are screwed onto these risers. So let's get our big chunky motherboard with the enormous fan on and see whether we can place it in here. This is our motherboard. It's very, very weighty with this cooler on it. It may be a better idea to take it off. It may be, but we're going to go with it, okay? So I want this bit pointing towards the back of the case. So I need to turn it all the way around like this. Handle it carefully, try not to let it bend. So this then is how it's going to drop in to the case, like this. It needs to be away from the back so that you can push it up against the I/O shield that you've struggled to put in the first place. Check for cables that might be in the way, like these drive cables here. Just push them to one side. Make sure the whole area is clear. This blooming fan header there needs to be out of the way. And so we can now gently place this in. Now, if you don't have these risers, then you can check. Okay, got one screw there, screw there, screw there. Those are going to line up. You've got then 3 screws here in the middle. Check that those are going to line up. And then 3 on this side. So I'm going to use the cooler itself as my handle, because that is very, very, very secure on there. And I'm going to carefully lower this in. Now you can hear that this only just fits. It's perfectly designed for the ATX form factor. Now that it's down, I'm going to shuffle it across and attempt to line it up here at the I/O shield, so that I know if I push that to the back, that is then going to come out through the correct holes. Now it's very important that you check that it's coming out of the right holes. So check around the back, make sure it's all lined up. Otherwise you're not going to be able to get in your USB ports and bits and pieces. So check that that's okay. Adjust a little bit, push on the front edge of the board against the I/O shield to make sure that goes in, and you should be able to see how the holes on the risers line up. Often you need to put a little bit of pressure on this edge of the board, pushing it back in order for the holes to line up. That's completely okay. That's because it's pushing against that I/O shield, and that is requiring a little bit of pressure to keep that in there. And what we need to do now is screw it in using the motherboard screws. Now the screws for screwing it in tend to be slightly larger. They're often like the drive screws or the PCI card screws, but they will come as a bag with your case, not with the motherboard. So you need to make sure that that is aligned as best you can. Now it may be, like with this one, I believe the middle riser is not actually a screw, it's just a header, a peg, and that helps you fit the board where it's supposed to go. So that's now dropped into that peg, which is nice, a really good, nice feature. So it looks to me like all of my screws are nicely laid up and nicely lined up. So I'm going to use the Be Quiet screwdriver, because it had a magnetic end, and maybe that's going to be useful to me. So I'm going to then screw in the motherboard. It's very important that you don't over tighten these screws, because it's quite easy to round either the screw itself or the thread inside the riser. And there are situations where you need to take the motherboard out. And so if you've rounded off the screws, then that makes that completely impossible. It may be when you're installing yours that the heatsink is just too big, it's too in the way and you can't work around it. Well then, take it off. Just be careful with the thermal grease so you don't get that all over yourself. Once it's in, just check that it's not moving or loose or flapping about anywhere. Check again round the back that the ports are poking out and nothing is strange or askew on the back. And then you can think to yourself, well, that's not a bad job. You can see here on the back, the back plate, so you can mount the cooler after you've put the motherboard into the system, because you can get access to the back plate here. This is not always the case on every single case, but if you do have access, then it's entirely up to you whether you install this as we did openly on the motherboard or whether you install it later. Right, I've had some trouble trying to film inside the case. It's causing me anxiousness and anxiety. So I've brought it to the floor to see whether this is a better place to capture what goes on inside this thing. Because now we have to run the cables from the power supply, run the cables from the hard drives and the other ins and outs of the case so that the motherboard is fully connected up and ready to go. Now the case being black, with everything being black and this being black inside here, makes it really difficult to see exactly what's going on. But we're just going to have to try our best. So what happens now? Well, now you need to plug in the motherboard. Power. Now if you have a power supply that has all the cables coming off, that's going to be hanging off the thing, this great big fat thing here. Now on the front edge of the motherboard here is a big wide socket that this will go into. The other end, which is usually a split end if it's a modular power supply, is what goes into the power supply. So in order to achieve this, we want this as nice and as tidy as possible. So in here there is a nice slot through which cables can go. So maybe the first thing we need to do is connect it to the power supply. Power supply is here. We need to look inside that cavity, which is difficult to see, and see if we can see where the motherboard connects. Yes, the motherboard is the two bottom parts here. So we need the split to go in there this way round and connect to our power supply. Like so. Now, it might well have been smarter to pull the power supply out of the back and mount the cables and do it that way. I don't know, but once things are connected up, that makes that more difficult. Now, in order to run this to the power supply connector, which is up here, we can put it through these handy slots here. Often on cases, you get these bits, which are really useful for attaching cable ties in order to tie stuff down, because the side of the case needs to go on here, and so they need to be nicely and tightly cabled. And then this is going to poke through here, and we'll be able to fix it on the other side. Now I'm going to rotate this to see whether it's easier to see. I'm also going to bring in the little GoPro to see whether you can see that there. So here is the motherboard connector. Here's the power connector that I've just fed through. And this needs to go the right way up. There's usually a little nodule bit on the side of it, and that goes with the clip. Now it should really only go in one way around, but if you push it hard enough you can get it to go in the wrong way. So this needs to be orientated, which is my favourite word of this video, this way round to fit into that socket. Give yourself a bit of slack to start with, and then nestle it in there and rock it down until it clicks and is firmly secured. And then this bit is very neatly going out of this hole here, so it's not dangling around inside the motherboard or causing problems with the airflow. It's not getting in the way of the fan. It's being nicely out of the way. Now next up, the CPU requires power, and that is through a little connector down here. So I'm going to throw some light on it. So you need to find the CPU cable, which looks like this. It looks very similar to the VGA cables as well, but the particular thing about it, so I've got two CPU cables here, is that one end will be split into two bunches of 4. They'll be labelled. They should be labelled. So I only need one of these. And it's the split end that goes somehow together, plugged into the motherboard, and the other end goes into the power supply. So let's try to put the power supply end in first, like we did before, and see where we get to. is that top one there. So that's relatively straightforward. So using my GoPro, you should be able to see the cabling in there. The power connector for it is all the way up on the other side of the motherboard here. So I'm going to want to run this in this kind of way. So I could go up here and then through, follow those cables, or I could go around this side. Maybe this side would be better. But I'm not giving myself an awful lot of slack. So if I go straight across first, put it in the socket, and then come back and tidy up this cable. So the socket I'm trying to get to is here. This is another one of those occasions where you think, well, maybe I shouldn't have had the enormous cooler in the way. But I'm persevering with it. Because whichever way you go, some things will be tricky. Now again, there's a clip down there that faces outwards, so you've got to get your cable round the correct way. There we go, that was good. That was good. Now for fans, there should be a number of fan headers on the motherboard. There's 2 here, there's some here. So I should have no problem in mounting this fan header directly to the board. This cable of course is a bit annoying, but you can use a cable tie or something else just to tie that off nicely. Right, now we have to deal with that big fistful of cables that comes from the top edge of the case and connects to the motherboard to provide you with USB ports and audio and other bits and pieces. Now these can just be stuffed right into the motherboard cavity, but it's nicer if they pop up through one of these so they're not making quite such a mess inside where your motherboard is. These are all the cables that plug onto the motherboard that give you the lights and the power switch and the reset switch, the power LED, things like that. Now ASUS provide this very useful little header to plug all of those cables into so they can go directly onto the board without trying to do them individually. So with this, it shows me exactly where they all need to go and is very, very useful. So let's plug those in before we have to get inside the motherboard space. LEDs of course need to be the right way round. Most other things don't matter. But it should be labelled positive and negative as it is on here or as it is on the motherboard. So for the moment, let's stuff all of these in through this hole and see then how we connect it up on the other side. So these all connect along this side, sort of the bottom edge of the motherboard. We have audio. HD audio tends to be over here. This is labelled AAFP on this motherboard. It can only go one way round because of the pins. There's one of these pins is blocked out, so it can't go anything other than one way round. So we can plug that in without any bother. The next one here is USB. There's usually a number of USB plug ports here, so you can choose whichever you like. This big thick cable is USB 3. Tends to be blue on the end. Again, it has a little nodule on it, so you know which way around to plug it in onto the board. Gives you a nice solid click. Then I've got my motherboard headers for the front panel, and they all go onto this last section over here, like so. Now ideally what I would like would be some way of tying these cables here. Now because of this bit here, which has never been in any other Fractal case, is causing me all sorts of trouble. Because normally there's space here and I could connect this up to some other power cables to tie those out of the way, or I could attach some kind of cable tie to something, but this is very frustrating, because when you're building this for a customer, you want them to be able to open the case and go, wow, that looks amazing. So that's definitely the vibe that you are after. So let's see if I can put a cable in there in order to cable tie it. Yep, did that all right. Now also on this edge I have 3 fan connectors, so I can take the fan plugs that came off the front fans and plug both of those in. Turn it back over again, and we can do something here to improve the run of these cables as well. So that's all quite neat there now, and you needn't spend a lot of time on it. The reason I do is because I've been building these for people who are paying me money, and so because of that I do absolutely the best job that I can do. If that involves putting in extra cable ties or attaching things to it or modifying the case in some way, then so be it. Right, we're very nearly there. So the last part to connect of this particular system is our 2 hard drives. And these are going to be connected to the 6 ports here. Now neither of these are actually system drives. The system drive is the one that's mounted, the M2 drive that's mounted beneath this heatsink on the motherboard itself. And so that is what I'm going to be installing Windows on. I'm not going to be installing it on these drives here. Now my advice when installing drives onto a system is to only install your system drive. And that way you ensure that when you install Windows, it doesn't accidentally get put onto the wrong drive, or system files don't find themselves onto the wrong drives. So even though we are desperate to plug these 2 cables in, I would advise not to until after you've installed Windows and are completely happy with it. Then add further drives one at a time after that and get them set up how you want. But these 2 are simply going to go into the drive sockets here once we've installed Windows. Which sockets they should go into is another question. You need to check the motherboard manual to see which order the ports are in, because that will affect the order that they appear in Windows, although these things can be changed. So that is our audio PC installed in the case. We could of course put the sides back on, but honestly I would leave it open until you are completely happy that the system is installed correctly. Because there may be fan adjustments, cooling adjustments, all sorts of bits and pieces, extra drives to go in. I am going to be putting a video card in, so I do a lot of video editing. And so you don't want to be putting the sides back on until your system is completely finished and about to go under your desk. So there you are. Our system is built and into its case. That last bit, dealing with the case, is fiddly. It's always fiddly. It's always hard work and slightly frustrating. You're trying to get your fingers in somewhere, and whichever way you do it, you're going to end up with small spaces trying to get clips and cables and screws in the right place. Even if you take that off, you've still got to get that on at some other point. And if you put it in after the event, you've got to get this middle fan connected, and you've got to get those connections on here and linked around the fins. It's difficult if you do it that way, and it's difficult, as you saw, if you do it the other way, where I've got this in here and then I'm trying to get a cable attached down here. It's fiddly. It is. It takes time. That's why I say you need to relax. You need to give yourself a bit of time. You need to put some music on, chill out, have a cup of coffee, you know, that kind of thing. Because if you start getting annoyed or frustrated with it, you're going to break something, and that'll be a shame. So I have my entire system plugged in. I don't have the additional drives plugged in, but I do have my system drivers already in there as an M2 card. Everything else is ready to go, and it should be ready to turn on. And I could do that. Shall I do that? Let's do that. So power goes in the back. Here you have a rocker switch to turn it on or off, and then there's the actual power button on the top of the case, which is connected to the motherboard internally, which you did earlier. So we're going to plug that in there. Now, you don't need a screen attached, mouse or keyboard or anything like that. All you need is power, and that will give you the ability to see whether the fans go around and if the lights come on. That's all we're going to do. So I turn on the rocker switch, then I press the nice big power button on the top. And look at that. We have lights. We have movement in fans. Fans are going round. So you can see We've got lovely lights on because these are disco dancing motherboards. Got fans going on. Fan on the back is going round. That is about it. The mission is a success. All that's telling us is that it's getting power, things are starting up, that the power button works, and that the connections are in the right place. Next, we need to look at the BIOS. The BIOS is the basic in-out operating system of the motherboard, and that sets various settings and runs really the whole show. But that's for another video. This, I think, is far enough for this one. So join us again on the next one when we'll be looking at the BIOS and how you set that up, and then from there we'll be installing Windows, and then we'll be testing audio software. It's a journey. Thanks for joining me, and in the meantime, go and make some tunes.